Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Roderick Flood, the Provost of Gresham, and it's a great pleasure to welcome you to this lecture this evening. And a particular pleasure, of course, to welcome our speaker, Steve Shirley, who's going to speak on A is for Autism. Steve is an extremely successful entrepreneur, founder of FI Group, which gave opportunities for women to work at home. And with the success of that venture, she has become a major philanthropist, a benefactor to the Company of Information Technologists, the Oxford Internet Institute, and many others, and has had a particular interest in autism. She is ambassador for philanthropy and devotes a great deal of her time to encouraging others to give in the way that she has done. So we're delighted to welcome Steve this evening. I should say that she's also an honorary doctor of my old university, and I was very pleased that we were able to give her that honour, but she's received many such others for her work. Steve, we are most grateful that you can spare the time to be with us, and we look forward to your talk.
Thank you very much, Provost.
Good evening, Provost, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you all for coming. I hadn't expected quite such a big theatre nor such a big crowd. Gresham College and its lectures were founded in 1597 to bring new learning to the City of London. And today its educational programme is disseminated electronically and includes a number of voluntary sector activities to which I hope this talk will make a strategic input. And there shall be time for questions and discussion afterwards. The great Rabbie Burns wrote that the purpose of life is a life of purpose. And the experience of caring for my autistic son Giles was my life for 35 years. And like many parents of a child with autism, the disorder came to dominate my life. My long investment and involvement with support services, education and training, and various other strategic initiatives in the autism sector, and currently this is via the Autistic charity studying the research into funding the research into the causes of autism. It's all grounded in my traumatic childhood. I've done nothing by myself. It's all been a matter of teamwork. Autism brings into focus what it is to be human. I was born in Germany at a time when Jewish families were categorized as subhuman. And we moved around Europe. I was too young to remember much of this, trying to find a safe place. And eventually, my parents did a very brave thing. They put me on a kinder transport from Vienna and sent me to England into the arms of strangers, thinking never to see me again. I was only 5 when my weeping mother put me on that train, a train of 1,000 children, 2 adults, so you can imagine the bedlam, put me on that train and then let go. And professionals also have to learn to let go. But for me, the phrase captures the experience that parents of learning disabled children and autistic children, the two, as you will become obvious, are not synonymous, letting go and letting others help your vulnerable child. Very difficult. I grew up in England, studied mathematics at night school, Sir John Cass College, now part of the Metropolitan University. I became a systems engineer and founded a very early software house that in 1962 pioneered, as the Provost had said, the position of women, especially in high tech, women with domestic responsibilities. And I was the first woman that, the only woman that, basically fighting for equal citizenship. Today I'm going to talk about autism, and shall interweave the story of my son Giles with the autism story. It's a lifelong developmental disorder. Over 500,000 people in the UK. It varies in severity, so it's called a spectrum disorder. Many people with autism, about 55%, are below the historic cutoff of an IQ of 70. But others, often described as having Asperger's syndrome, are highly intelligent. But all of them have difficulties in communicating, difficulties in forming relationships, and find it hard to make sense of the world around them. My Giles was a beautiful baby. We led a quiet, stable life in the country, and at first he seemed to be doing rather well. And then, like the changeling in the fairy story, he turned over a period of few days into a wild, unmanageable toddler. Not the terrible twos, but he was profoundly autistic. Autism at that time, this we're talking about the early 60s, was classed as it was a rare disorder. And today the latest estimates around 1 in 100 children, the increase being partly accounted for by redefinition. What we mean by autism has changed over the decades. And of course better diagnosis. But not all the increase in numbers is just better diagnosis and redefinition. There are no reliable figures available for adults, nor is there any actuarial information of any quality. But the rapid increase in numbers explains the poor, basically the national funding. It's poor, and the unacceptable waiting time for services that spell that waiting time means lost opportunity. Worldwide, a new case of autism is diagnosed about every 20 minutes. Although it has been separated out from learning disability for some 60 years now, the World Health Organization has only last year, and that was at the Shirley Foundation work really, is only last year naming autism as different from learning disability. And that's in a study of the epidemiology of the number of people with learning disability and autism in the mid to and low income countries. We know quite a lot about what's been happening in Japan and UK and the Netherlands as well, and the Scandinavian countries. But we don't really have anything solid to go on when it comes to Africa and Eastern Europe. The incidence does not seem to vary with climate, with diet, by continent. It certainly varies with gender, because autism is found about 4 times more often in boys than in girls. Of course, it presents itself somewhat differently, so there may be an element of underdiagnosis of the girls. One of the early studies found a significantly different link between autism and engineer parents. And there have been a raft of studies linking autism with difficult births, Jewish parents, to mercury from mobile phones, old iPod batteries, and other products of the electronic age. To firstborn children, none adding anything much to understanding, but the many adding to confusion. Equally, there's no evidence that vaccines are contributing to the increase in autism, but rather like the occasional child for whom eating a nut can bring on a life-threatening reaction. So there may be people, it's possible that some children, they have an immune system that can't deal with toxins, and so vaccinations could lead them to autism, because the story is not closed. The MMR case should have finished when Andrew Wakefield was struck off the medical register, but its serious repercussions linger on because people are not vaccinating their children worldwide, probably based on that. So far, about 20 genes are thought to be associated with autism susceptibility, not autism, the susceptibility to autism. And clues also come from simpler single gene disorders where there are autism-type characteristics. Autism has been known for a long time to run in families. If you have a child with autism, there's a 5 or 6% chance that a sibling would also be affected. The charity Autistica is investigating the incidents in countries such as Saudi Arabia, where it doesn't just happen that close family members marry, but it is actually the norm for them to do so. So the genetics in those countries is very different. And more than half the couples are close blood relatives, and so it's a fruitful geographic area for study. Giles was diagnosed at the Park Hospital in Oxford at the age of 3, and we were advised to put him into an institution and start our family anew. We sought genetic counselling, but there was then little understanding of what is now known to be a highly heritable disorder, and in any event, we decided, against the advice of the consultants, to concentrate on the child that we had, though mourning the child that might have been. In that dark age, learning disability was classed as mental handicap. Many children were categorised as ineducable, so there was no attempt to educate them. They came under health rather than education. And early exceptions to that categorisation was autism, so parents were pressuring the professionals to give a diagnosis of autism in order that the child should have some special education. That's an example of how statistics can get skewed in ways that, unless you were there and saw what happened, wouldn't be obvious. As one of the so-called refrigerator mums of the period, I was conscious that my maths degree was not a very good grounding for parenthood, but I couldn't believe that any mothering deficiencies could have affected my baby so catastrophically. My guilt, because that's what happens, of course, my guilt was not helped by terms such as elective mute, which may be a matter of semantics, but some of these phrases are quite important in society. And if we think how Mahatma Gandhi changed things for the untouchables in India by starting to refer to them as children of God. Today, the range of autism covers such a wide types of disability that we refer not to autism but to autisms. Some are regressive, as it was with my Giles, some not. It's striking that both often co-occur in the same families. Some are associated with epilepsy, some not. The high-functioning end, Asperger's syndrome. We say autistic spectrum, but since it ranges in at least 3 dimensions, language, social, obsessive focus on order, we should perhaps talk about an autistic space. Which way, we know very little. We were desperate, really, reading anything that could be remotely relevant. The then current fad was for mega vitamins, putting mega vitamins by pills into the child's diet. And even today there is a disturbing fringe on the web offering conspiracy theories galore and at a price. It's clear that certain interventions help certain children, but no one knows which is going to help whom and in what circumstances. So parents can bankrupt themselves financially, emotionally, for treatments having absolutely no effect, sometimes to an abusive level, because a strict training regime for a young child of up to 40 hours a week is not, to my mind, respectful of that little person. And there have been tragic examples of more severe interventions, and I'm reminded of Florence Nightingale's stricture to do no harm. And educators also need a Hippocratic oath, because without that we're acting indeed as if the child were ineducable. And we need to distinguish between child assent, parental permission, legal authorization, and moral responsibility. Moral responsibility. The National Autistic Society, which is the lead charity in England, spun off Research Autism some time ago, and that compares and contrasts the many different interventions so as to give parents meaningful facts and figures about some of the 700 interventions it lists. There are whole schools dedicated to what is called applied behaviour analysis, ABA, and it was devised by a guy, Ivor Lovers, in the mid-60s, so it's still relatively young, and it uses rewards like a Smartie or a raisin, the tiniest progress in social behaviour or academic, what they call learn units. Learn unit might be something like put the cup on the saucer, not throw it across the room. And if achieved 18 times out of 20 over a period of 3 days, the child, the pupil, the student is credited with having mastered that learn unit. Just because pupils can't speak doesn't mean that the national curriculum is closed to them. They're all learning to learn. They're no longer considered ineducable. And educators working one-to-one are sort of an ABA hallmark. And across the UK, that's a one-to-one working model. One-to-one, just think of the cost of that. One-to-one is used in many schools that are not even associated with ABA. And of course the speech and language therapy, some of which is based on applied behaviour analysis, and that's just to reinforce desired speech patterns. Given the hype in the media about diet, I'd like to make some brief comments. Removing grain, especially wheat, and dairy products from the diet are two common treatments that work for some, but not others. If they work, it's very dramatic. Only days for children, weeks for adults, if it works. Note, though, there has yet no scientific review has shown any, no study has shown any positive results. That's anecdotal evidence. And in Who's Who, I give my recreation as wishful thinking. And one must never forget wishful thinking when a new intervention is heralded. We want it to work. Everybody wants it to work. There was another great guy, Dr. Eric Schoppler, who, another pioneer in the field of autism education, not a name known to everyone, but this kind and humane man founded something called TEACH, spelled T-E-A-C-C-H, but at least I can remember it's TEACH. It's used all over the world and is one of the most widespread approaches to autistic education. And Dr. Schoppler trained with the famous, world-famous, but to me infamous psychoanalyst Bruno Bettelheim, who compared the parents of autistic children to concentration camp guards. Eric Schoppler, together with the late Dr. Bernard Rimland, co-founder of the Autism Society of America, saw instead caring people who had frequently raised normal children in the same household. And those two first described autism as a brain disorder, not a mental illness. And the aging of so many autism pioneers has triggered one of my recent projects to commission by Adam Feinstein a history of autism, conversations with the pioneers, and it's out on the table outside if you'd like to have a look at it. That was published last year by Wiley Blackwell. Last year there was also a first ever study of an intervention called Sunrise, sun as distinct from daughter, not sun as opposed to moon. That was carried out by Lancaster University in association with Northwestern in the States. As yet unpublished, this recorded some improved behaviour. By that they mean child-initiated social interaction and communication, which is what after all we're all about. But they recorded some improved behaviour after a 40-hour intensive Sunrise intervention with 6 children with autism matched with 6 controlled children. It would have been interesting to have had a larger sample and also to compare with other 40-hour interventions, both for the subject children and for the control group who received no intervention whatsoever. And I say this because the earliest autism research project that the Shirley Foundation funded, if we ever sponsored, was very like that. But the sample sizes were larger, and even with larger sample sizes, we cancelled the project about a third of the way through because it clearly wasn't going to get anything significant. There's an intervention called facilitated communication. It's not in regular use in this country, but it's widely used with apparent success in Germany. And that's a controversial system, originally from Australia, which it's claimed non-verbal children, individuals, can communicate via a keyboard. Its detractors insist that this is invalid because, like the Ouija board, it's the assistant who's holding the elbow in support. It's the assistant who's doing the communication, not the subject. Certainly, that was my belief. And I'm trying to be open-minded because of a severely autistic boy, Jamie Burke, who was one of the earliest students and one of the most successful beneficiaries. And he now has a lot to say, only partly by keyboard, but he is communicating about and around his years of silence. Now, even one such example encourages parents to demand standard educational opportunities for all. It's ever our dream, or is it nightmare, that inside every child with autism is a normal child trying to get out. I've learnt relatively recently to consider autism as a different way of living. And that makes conductive education, in which teachers draw from their pupils rather than impart knowledge. Conductive education is much more natural. And education has in any case changed over the years. Mission has changed from knowledge to skills. Skills that last rather than knowledge that fades. And that's dramatically true of special education. And like the sculptor chipping away at the stone to expose the statue within, teachers reach out to educate the child within. Longitudinal studies following children over a long period of time, specific to autism, concentrate on children at risk by backing and tracking the development of babies born into families where there is already an older sibling diagnosed with autism. Researchers are able to spot potential problems, not necessarily make accurate diagnoses, but a year or possibly as early as 9 months. And that's valuable time to be gained in which to intervene. And certainly looking back at Giles and really just looking at his photographs in the early days, there were some clues there, which I certainly nor anybody else spotted. I made many mistakes trying to raise Giles. Even with all the love in the world, it's not a pretty story. Huge amounts of energy and effort. At one time, I seriously thought of getting a sheepdog to help me with Giles. And I'm intrigued to later learn of so-called assistance dogs trained for that precise function. Chaos, I mean, it really was chaos, reigned in the years 3 to 5, but I could pick him up then and so avoid the worst disasters. He was doubly difficult in puberty, which came much too early at 11, and at the same time epilepsy started, and about a third of people with autism are either born with or develop epilepsy. And brain research shows the closeness of the abnormalities. The association between autism, epilepsy, learning disabilities such as tuberous sclerosis, Fragile X, and Down syndrome, those associations are important in meeting affected people's needs. But next to nothing is known about the nature of the links. At one time, Giles was prescribed lithium on the basis of his possible manic depression. Depression is equally probable as existing alongside autism. And the suicide statistics for Asperger adults is an horrendous 6%, nearing the 10% rate of the very severe mental illnesses such as schizophrenia. Asperger children probably realise that they are different to other children between the ages of 6 and 8. It's important to help them fit in perhaps by getting someone from their own age group to choose their clothes and supervise their haircuts. Bullying is 4 times more likely from their peers than for their peers. And in the teenage years, an average of 1 in 10 Asperger adolescents are victimized by their peers. Now, those figures are probably conservative because the children accept bullying as, well, that's just the way it is. And what is undisputed is that 6 out of every 100 adults with Asperger's succeed in taking their own lives. Given those facts, we really must learn more about the nature of autism spectrum disorders, and investment in research and for further knowledge is absolutely essential. Life is not just the one with autism. We decided to restrict our family, but we had always to keep going, not least keep our own sanity. And as I said earlier, what the family needed was a wraparound program of support. Giles didn't sleep much, so my husband and I operated a shift system. No wonder that the divorce rate among partners and parents of autistic children is 80% breakdown. And looking back, it was a terrible period. One of the practical research studies that my Shirley Foundation has funded much later was a comprehensive study of the sleep patterns and parents' perceptions of sleep patterns. And that was at Oxford's Park Hospital, the very same hospital that Giles went to for diagnosis. He went there 8.5 months it took to diagnose him, Monday to Friday, and with me in the associated mothers unit, still trying to run my company. It was Great Ormond Street Hospital that first used the A word, autism, to me, and introduced a child therapist. And there's now a national centre for high-functioning autism disorders at Great Ormond Street Hospital. It sees children aged 3 to 16 who are already in mainstream education, offering diagnosis and recommending bespoke intervention for each child. And they also train professionals. One of their current research projects is to reduce mental health problems, because a lot of people have both. And always to the fore, last year they started a study into transitions. Transition from primary school to secondary school, transition especially into the adult world. And this is for pupils with high-functioning autism who move from primary to secondary education. And there's a training pack for teachers and families is being planned. And the plan is to have support workers to help patients with autism in the hospital. And my God, when Giles was there at one time, I could have done with some of that. I mean, too often researchers don't talk to clinicians, and clinicians don't talk to parents. And nobody seems to really listen to the parents. And we are experts in our own children. And it's important for parents to trust to instincts and not let the professionals push the family into anything. And there's a crying need to train mainstream teachers to make the term inclusive more meaningful, to have associated specialist units and indeed special schools. Giles lost the few words that he had as a toddler and never spoke again. For others, vocabulary and pronunciation seems to rely less on family conversations than on TV and Americanisms of film. Giles had one term at an old-style training centre until he flinched when I waved him goodbye, and I realised somebody had been hitting him. Parents, indeed everyone, have to learn to listen hard, listen very hard for non-communicating children. And later Giles went to an excellent weekly boarding primary school. We never managed to find any secondary education for Giles. He was, after all, then classed as ineducable. There were occasional day services that wanted to help, but often I'd just get home after settling him in somewhere for the day to get a somewhat distraught phone call with somebody saying through gritted teeth, "We can't manage him. Would you come and take him away?" It was, indeed, an awful, ghastly period. We got a bit of financial help from various grants, most of whose application procedures were not relevant to autism. And there's a crying need for more and better partnerships to meet people's needs rather than trying to squeeze people into a framework of existing services. A quarter of pupils on the spectrum are excluded from school at some time or other. 2/3 of them excluded more than once, with others being bullied and ostracised in inappropriate settings. The National Autistic Society reported that only 40% receive a service that is suitable for their needs, only 40%. And if that's poor, it's a lot better than the 3% of adults they estimate to be getting suitable services. But things are improving. Eventually, when Giles was 13, I cracked up, and both of us finished up in hospital. I came out of mine after a month and was back at work within the year. But Giles stayed in one of the so-called subnormality hospitals in a locked upstairs ward with 12 other adolescent boys. He stayed there for 11 years. We took him home every weekend and then couldn't manage even that, so were reduced to taking him out for a weekly picnic in the grounds. Fine in summer. Awful in winter when we cowered under a heat-reflecting sheet. Very difficult to retain any sense of family. When I phoned midweek to learn how things were going, all too often the response was, "We've been hoping to go out." And after 25 years of care in the community, there are still remaining people leading such restricted lives, hoping to go out. So Giles became institutionalized in hospital and, as can so often happen, lost most of his human rights. And the abuses made us determined to get him out, back into the community, and so we set up my first charity called Kingwood. Giles was the first resident in the first service. And today Kingwood supports over 50 autistic adults whose needs challenge existing services, some in their own homes, funded by housing benefit, some in parental homes, a few in a small facility for 5 residents, and Kingwood, interestingly, is just starting to use assistance dogs. Now, few adults who received a childhood diagnosis of autism are self-sufficient. I mean, less than 10% are currently doing well, and the remainder are dependent on support in all aspects of life, I mean, the brilliant artist, Stephen Wiltshire, can't cross the road by himself. He earns his own living through his art, but I can't understand him. I could if I spent some time with him. And he can't cross the road by himself. They need support in all aspects. And the average additional lifetime cost resulting from autism with learning disability is estimated to average 4.6 million. And of that, only 7% is education. Some is in direct support, but most of it is in lost employment costs, lost employment for the individual, lost employments for the parents. And the national cost of autism in this country averages an astonishing 28 billion every year. And to set a scale on that, 28 billion was the cost of the Northern Rock fiasco. We never got anywhere near considering even voluntary work for Giles. But jobs are now achievable for some of his peer group via work placements and support from various organisations, notably the NAS Prospect Service. Any work seems to be best based on a child's specialist interest. They have this hyper-focus. So in our case, if it were today, one would be focusing Giles like cats and jigsaws and would be sweeping up in a cattery or working in a toy shop or something like that. But university students on the autistic spectrum, usually reading maths or computer science, need an understanding environment, and a lot of them dropped out. Several city organisations committed to diversity employ staff on the autistic spectrum, often starting as interns. And that's true even in today's straitened circumstances. And managers have commented that learning to understand communication difficulties of those with autistic spectrum disorders has helped them to communicate with their whole team more effectively. Let me tell you about one such organisation, the investment bank, Goldman Sachs. It has an Asperger syndrome initiative, and it's had that since 2003. And they worked with the National Autistic Society. They started with one man with Asperger's on work experience. And although well qualified, he'd never worked before. And now he's permanently employed, not with them as it happens, but with another company. Their second Asperger syndrome worker, after a 5-week placement, secured a position with the Royal Courts of Justice in the Strand. So Goldman Sachs have gone ahead with paid interns. They've now developed good disability practice throughout the firm, and so far this has given 26 people the opportunity of an internship, often going on to ongoing employment. And they've committed to at least 4 paid placements a year. And BT has comparable policies and practice. Of the 300,000 people of working age in this country on the autistic spectrum, 78% of average or above average intelligence. Most of them, 78%, are of average or above average intelligence. And only 15% are in full-time paid employment, and far less than the proportion of disabled people generally. There's no doubt that people with Asperger's may provide accurate, loyal, hard-working, honest staff who perform well on repetitive, factual tasks. Inquiry systems is the one that's most often quoted. because their approach is straightforward and honest. They may have excellent technical skills, a good knowledge of facts and figures, and those staring at the screen-type jobs are well suited to people with Asperger's syndrome. Nothing to do with people. They're interacting just with a screen. So they make good employees, but equally they can create difficulties. They can be negative, undermining everything, quiet, know-it-alls, thinking of all the reasons why not to. And people are paid to do a certain job and may have to be shown how to present a positive face. And large groups may be too stressful. One-to-one working is ideal, but not everybody can provide a designated workplace, not a hot desk, facing the wall perhaps, special lighting or tinted lenses to filter out the frequencies that cause problems, or headphones to block out the noises that from the lights perhaps, which don't worry me at all but are excruciating for them. Not everybody can provide that sort of environment. So people with autism react and relate better to the consistency of computers than to unpredictable human beings. Just as we find their behaviour unpredictable, they find us unpredictable. And so our information technology enables them to work better and faster, as it can do for us all. We accept that it is discriminatory not to provide documents and keyboards in Braille for people who are blind. But few understand that social inclusion can be equally actively discriminatory in the case of Asperger's. And perhaps we all need to adapt our ways of working rather than the conceitful reverse, expecting intelligent adults with autism to adapt to standard work environments. They must be afforded equal citizenship. Another strategy is to help young adults develop specialisms in tasks such as graphic arts, where customers seek them out as a consultant. Pattern cutting in Savile Row is another highly skilled task that has proved successful. Caring for autistic people really is very hard, but autism can mean originality, it can mean creativity and a sort of innocence. I mean, my experience is with a profoundly affected child in days long past, but a recent survey showed that both parents and professionals still feel that there is, and I quote, very little available indeed. One of the Shirley Foundation's smaller projects was the £20,000 matched by the Disabilities Trust to support Autism Awareness Year in 2002. And that brought together 800 national autism charities, including not-for-profit groups like after schools and things like that. It brought them together for the first time and led to a number of standing partnerships. Nobody does anything by themselves. And I believe in partnerships and alliances in all shapes and sizes. There's so much to do that reinventing the wheel makes me just see red. And only by getting everybody together to lobby on shared points are we likely to make anything happen in time for today's children. Autism Awareness Day led to some groups coordinating a bit, starting with the day on April the 2nd each year. And this year we did the first of some annual surveys of the autism, and we got 730 responses, which are just being analysed as to what people and organisations think. My largest charitable project was Prior's Court School near Newbury in Berkshire. And that's for pupils with both autism and learning disabilities and, frankly, challenging behaviour, because it's a very expensive residential school and local authorities do not send children there until they're extremely difficult. But the school made me think about what education is all about. Certainly education has changed its mission. Education used to be about knowledge. And now that each of us has access to so much information, education is more about skills, skills which last, rather than facts which fade. And that's especially true of special education. Prior's Court is a day and residential school and was the focus of both my dreams and waking hours for all of 5 years. 3 times I nearly gave up on the project. I just thought I wasn't going to be able to make the school happen. First was when the planned relationship with the twin schools in America and Japan, who had initially inspired me, that relationship broke down. Secondly, when we had only 2 pupils signed up on opening, and we'd already engaged 28 staff. No. And thirdly, when Giles died, unexpectedly, in the middle of the project, and I lost all momentum. It's cruel that loss becomes ever more painful. With most things, it's easier the second, the third time. Grief, the last gift, the expression and proving of love, is different. Our earlier sorrows, mourning the child who might have been, mourning the grandchildren we were not going to have, each seemed to sharpen the pain of his death. But love transcends death and grows to take over the bereaved person's life. I have now learnt to live without Giles, without his need of me. Bittersweet. It is a wonderful relief not to have him survive me. But the death of any child is unbelievably painful. And for a long time, his sheer absence was like, I imagine, losing a leg. Life becomes lopsided and out of balance, but sooner or later one does learn to walk with crutches. And there's always an upside to difficult times. The newfound freedom from worry energized me anew. Autism has become an ongoing focus, a mission that makes sense of Giles's life and puts value on mine, the life that was saved. 10 years ago, I started to focus on the big question. What causes autism? Indeed, what autism is, as distinct from what it looks like. Science has also moved from behaviour to biology. So let me talk a bit about what's happening in biomedical research. By measuring head circumference, children, babies with autism has been shown to have an average normal head size at birth, but increase above the population norm over the next 3 years. So that on average, children with autism have larger heads. But this evens out. What can that mean? Internal imaging technology show differences in brain anatomy, so that, for instance, we normal people process faces in a special part of the brain. Those with autism use a different part of the brain. What can that mean? And recent research shows quite clearly that it is the cabling between the different parts of the brain that is the central problem. What can that mean? The Autistic Charity aims to determine the causes of this baffling, it is a perplexing disorder. The dream is for some practical biomarker that you can take a blood test and tell, but, you know. There are a number of programs. The international search for the genes that, if not causing autism, but rather confer susceptibility, is the Autism Genome Project led by Professor Tony Monaco in Oxford. And there are exciting projects for future work that will support the diagnosis and treatment of autism. It's only prospects. Autistica also funds pilot studies and mentored fellowships to increase the research capacity. It led to the foundation of, and contributed to the funding of, a new chair in autism in Cardiff University, and it's currently doing much the same for a fellowship in autism in Scotland. There are also international fellowships to date with Saudi Arabia, which I've already mentioned, and with India. People are always asking if we can't do more, but to date no one has yet complained that we do too much. The next 5 to 10 years are expected to deliver significant advances in brain imaging. And progress is hampered by not having enough post-mortem brain material and by the non-standardization of imaging systems. You can't seem to interchange things always. And the Autism Brain Bank was funded a few years ago by a single unrestricted donation, and it already has, after a few years, 15 brains. It doesn't sound very much, but each capable of providing material for several research projects, and some brains, 855 projects has now been approved for the donated brain tissue. And the tissue of some individuals, tiny slivers of brain on a slide, have been used for over 30 laboratories, so it's very, very valuable. And control samples are also needed. We don't know which area of the brain will become the focus of future research, so samples are taken from all parts of the brain, and my own brain, including also body, is to go to medical research. There's still no known cure for autism, although some interventions with people of high intellect do result, after many years, in a few people learning to lose their mannerisms and become seemingly normal. Certainly, I have learnt to view autism as a different way of living. But there's no way in which I would ever choose to have a child so profoundly handicapped as Giles, because despite everything we tried to do, the quality of his life was very poor. But as many people have found, research is slow. Research is expensive. It demands involvement and cannot be delegated very far. And the best planning in the world gives perhaps a 1 in 10 chance of a particular research project finding anything that will make a difference. Progress depends on research, yes, but also vigorous information change among researchers and translation of their findings into service provision. It's no use keeping it in the laboratory. Mercer's, which supports Gresham College, and the girdlers and cloth workers, livery companies, among the city organisations that provide charitable support for autism. But, Provost, autism is no longer on the fringe of policy making, on the fringe of provision and, importantly, knowledge. It is a mainstream and very serious concern. It's recently been rebranded as autism quotient, the autism quotient implying that it's an inherent human condition. And autism strikes at the very centre of what we think of as being human. To understand the autistic mind and allow lives of equal citizenship is a major and crucial problem. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope that by telling you my personal story, to have spread new learning in a way that Sir Thomas Gresham would have approved. I thank you for listening to me, and I'm very happy to take questions. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Steve, both for sharing your own life experiences so movingly and for illuminating such a topic of such importance and such difficulty. Steve has said that she would take one or two questions. We must finish in 5 minutes or so, but if anybody has a question, please take the microphone when it circulates. Who would like to ask a question?
First of all, thank you very much for that very inspiring lecture. I have an interest in this because I have a grandson who is severely autistic, and he's coming 7 now, lives in the States, has no speech at all, and he is undergoing the ABA therapy and variations of that. I wonder if you would like to comment a bit more. I know you mentioned it, but you didn't say that much about it. Do you have any further comments on ABA?
Well, it's the best that you can do, quite honestly. It's worldwide. It has been measured to be effective. You can train people to apply it. You can train parents to apply it with their children or grandparents. And one could not imagine a better intervention at the moment. It's not to say we wouldn't hope for something better in 20 years' time, but that's the best that we've got. There are certain organisations in this country, by the way, that are supportive of grandparents, because Autistica, for example, has a group of grandparents who have different problems to parents, different interests, but if you have a grandchild with these sorts of problems, maybe remotely in another country or in another part of this country, it's nice to get together. It's good and helpful to get together with others. So I'm sorry it's happened to your family.
Thank you.
I hope it'll work out all right. I hope I haven't given too depressing a story, but that's how it was with me.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for sharing your experience with us. I just wondered, what were your son's abilities? Because I always believe that every human being has some abilities.
Well, we try and focus with any vulnerable person on what they can do rather than what they can't do. And it's very easy superficially to say, well, he couldn't speak. Nor could he communicate very well, because speech is just a part of that. But he did have a sense of humour, surprisingly enough. He could sort of fool around when he was in the right sort of mood and giggle and get us laughing in a reasonably, but it was pretty rare, frankly. He eventually, and by the time he was about 25, I'm talking about, he had a very good carer who helped him to use colour to make pictures. He couldn't make a picture at all, but he used the colour to do certain abstracts. I've got one or two up at home that are quite pleasing. But that, for him, was very creative. He would concentrate on painting for 5 minutes and then rush off and do something else. He was physically very strong, so we'd do 6-mile walks on a Saturday. So he had that sort of gross motor grace He didn't have minor motor skills. He couldn't do very much there. He ate phenomenally, had very high energy. And when he smiled, you could live on it for a week.
You talked about autistic children using a different part of their brain for face recognition. I just wondered if they actually had difficulties recognising faces compared with other people, or whether they were just as effective using the different part of their brain.
Do autistic children have difficulty in recognising faces? Yes, it seems that they do. You can measure the age at which an infant responds to a face, particularly a mother's or carer's face. And with autistic babies, this is significantly later. One of the tests that I can remember was done in one case. We were in a thing, there was a curtain along one side, and the therapist drew the curtain, and behind was a mirror. Giles didn't even bother to look. You know, this dramatic vista suddenly appearing. So his switching off was very, very strong. He was opting out. He didn't want to know. He was quite self-contained. He wasn't really unhappy. Did he recognise me? He never called me mother, but he certainly recognised me as a useful person to have around. I would, check that his life was good. To be honest, I don't think he ever recognised his father. Derek would come home from work. He had a very regular job, and as most families do, oh, look, here's Daddy, let's go and greet Daddy, he's home from work. And so you make a big fuss of it, but it was me rather than Giles didn't really recognise him. Over the years that improved slightly, because as he got bigger, Derek could still do things with him when I couldn't. But it can be a very, very profound disorder, but not for everyone. Earlier today I was talking with somebody who's clearly going to go to university. Doesn't mean to say he's not difficult or not autistic, but he's bright. He is very intelligent. Can you get him to do anything? I know a young boy who plays the piano beautifully. And I thought, well, you could get a job in a piano music shop or something, playing one of the many pianos. You can't ask him, Benedict, will you go and play something on that piano? It doesn't work. He just doesn't. He doesn't want to play now. Very difficult.
Well, I'm afraid we must stop for the reason I've just given you. But may I, on your behalf again, thank Steve very much for a most interesting and most moving talk to us this evening. Thank you so much.